John Light, L-I-G-H-T, Worrilow, W-O-R-R-I-L-O-W, 303 East Locust Street, Lebanon, Pennsylvania, 17042-5519. My blood type comes later, Joanne. 16 East High Street, here in Lebanon, on April 25th, 1921. Born at home. And our maternal grandfather owned all of that property. It was a development which he called the Heights. And that was one of the higher points, but new in Lebanon at that time. So again, that whole area, as a little boy, I used to ride horseback because it was a farm, my maternal grandfather's farm. So our father was a co-founder of Lebanon Steel Foundry on December 11th, 1911. And he and his partner in co-founding Lebanon Steel Foundry, Thomas S. Quinn, they shared room 8 at the YMCA. That's the old YMCA built in 1906. But they worked for a steel foundry on North 10th Street, a small foundry where my uncle was in charge of operations and my father was in charge of sales. And they separately went into the general manager and asked for an increase in compensation, a $25 a month increase, and they were declined. They were turned down. So they went back to room 8 in the old YMCA and decided to co-found their own company, Lebanon Steel Foundry, which they did. And that's down at first, well it was, it's now since defunct, but that was at First Avenue and East Freeman Street. Lebanon Steel. It was there because at that time, because they later married sisters, so the Quinn children and the Worrilow children of that generation were first cousins by reason of our mother's sisterhood. But their grandfather, in other words, their father was Harry H. Light and his wife Emma, who were pillars in this church at Zion Lutheran. But then they co-founded that at that location because Harry H. Light, the girl's father, his father, Samuel Light, SS standing for Simon's son. And his home, if you're familiar with 2nd Avenue and Lehman Street, Stan's Bar that's a double house. Stan's Bar is to the west. My great-grandfather lived on the other side, in other words, the east side of that double house. But he owned all that land. Whether he gave them a special price because he wanted them to marry his granddaughters, I'm not clear. But at the same time, that's why Lebanon Steel Foundry was founded there, in a very bitter, because their former employer, when they got the mail, would not deliver the mail because he was so angry for their having left their employ and co-founding their competitive institution, Lebanon Steel Foundry, whose employment, incidentally, reached 1,750 during the Second World War, when women, of course, were employed to meet the demands of war work. The railroad was there long before Lebanon Steel Foundry was founded. Of course, Bethlehem Steel, Bethlehem Steel bought the American Iron and Steel Company in 1916, and Bethlehem Steel was the dominant steel industry. They must have had nearly 3,000 employees here, but they were along the railroad tracks, of course, long before Lebanon Steel Foundry was. But our grandfather, maternal grandfather, Harry H. Light, he was active also in the American Iron and Steel Company, so, and had real estate interests, a water company. Well, he had the Lebanon Drop Forge Company, which was Vernon Bishop's National Central Chemical when Vernon bought that. My grandfather died January 5th of 1940. And of course, had a good many real estate, owned a good deal of property at that time. Probably more than he should have because of during the Depression, we almost had to stop eating to pay the taxes. All of what is now the George Christensen, Gary Matthews, all of that complex down there at the east end of town, that whole development, that was all my grandfather's. Purchased by U.S. Steel, actually, during the war, the Second World War, to provide the limestone deposits that they anticipated they might need with the war work. But of course, they never were activated. And when my grandfather died, all of that real estate was sold. It was my first job.
Tell me a little bit about it.
65 cents an hour. That was the largest percentage increase in compensation. Our father was paying us 10 cents an hour to weed the lawn at Brosnan Hill, the family home, which we moved into on October 1, 1930. But then the crash came, and of course October 29th of 1929, and that prompted him to reduce the weekly allowance of the Worrilow children from 25 cents to 10 cents an hour. And then when we reached our 16th birthdays, the boys were allowed to work at Lebanon Steel Foundry during the summertime. To go from 10 cents an hour to 65 cents an hour, that was the largest percentage increase in compensation I've ever experienced. Crash also brought the reduction in our weekly allowance from 25 cents to 10 cents. But that reduction from 25 cents to 10 cents, that's what led me to offer my service, offer myself to Mr. Hershey to be adopted, if he agreed to restore my allowance from 10 cents to 25 cents. In fact, my father, when he reduced our allowance, asked my reaction, and I said, well, I thought before you reduced our allowance from 25 cents to 10 cents, you should have considered terminating the governess. We had a governess at Brosnan Hill who looked after us and so on. And I thought but if Mr. Hershey adopted me, I told my father, I thought that would make my room available. My brother and I shared the third floor of Brosnan Hill, and that would make my room available to rent out, and then that income could increase my brother and my sister's allowances from the 10 cents back to 25 cents. But it never came about. But
How did they make steel?
Well, these are all electric furnaces, and not initially at Lebanon Steel Foundry, but very shortly thereafter, electric. And Lebanon Steel Foundry really prospered and played a dominant role in the steel foundry industry. Our contribution during the Second World War, during the Korean conflict and so on, was largely in armor for tanks. And the armor, we did not have the capacity to build a tank itself. That was made, the body of the tank was made up in Berwick, Pennsylvania, American Car and Foundry, ACF. They made it, but we made parts that were tank armor that were involved in the finished tank. The earliest tanks, which we have photographs of both at the Historical Society, a 25-ton tank, was when we went to war with only a 37 millimeter cannon, so to speak, almost like throwing rocks in a wartime. A 37 millimeter is a very modest, but it was, at the time, it was the only armor, the only weapon aboard that 25-ton tank. Incidentally, that tank, which we had one near the Lauser Park, if you know where I am, near the Quality Inn, and the government said to us, when I was in the mayor's office, said to us, if we may take that tank down to Fort Hood, which is the armor capital of the United States Army, we would like you to give it to us, and we'll fly it down there and put it in the museum. And so we did that, took that tank and sent it down there. Apparently, they have no record of that, because later somebody, Harry Gates' son, served in Fort Hood, and I asked him to check it out, and they said they have no record that it came from Lebanon, Pennsylvania, unfortunately. But anyway, the point is then we replaced it with a naval gun piece. We didn't care for the youngsters who would get up, and we didn't want them to hurt themselves, pinch fingers and so on. So we welded everything shut. Now the big tank that's out there now replaced the naval gun piece. End of comment, I'm not sure. And we had large furnaces, which were ours, large furnaces. Again, electric steel production. But we also, in 1948, built a stainless steel foundry. And we had a high regard, or we were, I think, held in high regard. Our father, in charge of sales, felt that price should never be a consideration, or the quality and service, so we never competed on the basis of price. In other words, the product was fully priced. The important concern was to build the quality that the product, the stainless steel, And there were other kinds of steel too that were involved, all produced by Lebanon Steel Foundry. There's a difference though in a foundry product and Bethlehem Steel. We even sold a few items to Bethlehem Steel. There they made nuts, bolts, sucker rods, and so on, but they had equipment that turned out product as fast as you could count it, or faster than you could count it. At Lebanon Steel Foundry, our products were all handmade. A production order for us might be 12, 15, 20 pieces, but that's not done by machine. And when the union came in 1942, when the union came in, of course, they compared their wages with those of Bethlehem Steel. But the steel foundry, because so much was handwork, couldn't possibly compete on the same scale, compensation scale, with Bethlehem Steel. But Bethlehem Steel was the dominant industry or the company in Lebanon County. Coincidentally, a few days ago, I think Bethlehem Steel closed at less than 1 cent per share. That was founded in 1902 by Charles M. Schwab, and I think even he died finally in bankruptcy.
I heard you say that there was perhaps limestone furnaces used to make a handmade product out of steel.
Well, lime played a part, of course, but limestone is not nearly the factor that it was in the Cornwall furnace. You're going back now to 1742, and when George Washington came up here and to inspect and where they had the Hessian mercenary prisoners operating or helping to operate the Cornwall furnace. So, but electric furnaces, and almost all of Lebanon Steel Foundry's product came from scrap. In fact, it might be interesting to you that when the 3 Quinn boys and the 2 Worrilow boys returned from the Second World War, and we all joined the company. But among other things, we made suggestions to our fathers, the co-owners, each owned 1/2 of the company, of areas that we could economize, where we thought we could be more profitable as a company. And one of the areas that we suggested was to get competitive bids on scrap. Scrap was very important to us. Our material, which went into the furnaces, was largely scrap. They still standing at Lebanon Steel Foundry along First Avenue, are the scrap bins, the areas. The railroad cars would come in there, a magnet would unload and put them in the scrap bins. But when we went to our fathers and made this suggestion, the answer was, gentlemen, Luria Brothers staked us to our first 2 railroad cars of scrap when we started Lebanon Steel Foundry. We couldn't afford to pay them, and they took a chance on us, and they provided it. We paid them back later, but the point is their loyalty to us in order to get us started. We therefore thank you for your suggestion, but we reject it. We're going to continue to buy our scrap from Luria Brothers, and as out of loyalty to their early loyalty to us, if you understand the founding of the company. Go ahead.
Okay, so the product is produced from scrap metal.
Correct.
And it comes in by railroad car. It gets
Much
picked
of
up
it,
by
yeah.
a magnet and put into a bin.
Correct.
What happens with it now?
Well, then, those bins are located very close to the large foundry building built in 1929. And therefore, again, the magnet came into play where the magnet would bring the scrap out of the bin, and a very short distance would deposit into the furnaces, the 2 large furnaces. And then, of course, you would melt the steel. But then, of course, in a foundry, you have to have a pattern, and the pattern is owned by the customer. But we like to keep the pattern, store the pattern, because then you have perhaps a better chance of getting the next order. But a pattern is divided in half because you have to get the pattern out of the sand in order to provide the mold in which to pour the metal, so that the wooden pattern is then removed and the two halves, called cope and drag, they are put together, and in that space or that design, you pour the metal, and that, of course, takes the shape of the pattern, and that's your casting. Blueprints, of course, determine the pattern design. But we had pattern makers outside the company who would provide those patterns, which would be charged and owned by the customer.
How long does it take to cool?
Well, it would depend, but the rough casting, and it is rough, but this is why they have different kinds of sand. The finest kind of sand is the kind that the metal goes against. In other words, the metal comes in contact with the finest sand. The support sand, or back sand, or heap sand as they call it, would provide the support behind the virgin sand, because you didn't want the expense of the expensive sand, but you had to have the support of the cheaper sand. And then, of course, you had what they call a flask, and that's what the mold was contained, and then they poured the metal into that. Then that would be the rough casting. After it cooled, or almost cooled, it would go to what they call the shakeout. Now the shakeout was where the casting, again, on a grill, a metal grill that was shook just as you would expect. But that shook the sand, the loose sand, off of the casting, and was recovered, or else disposed of. In other words, it was caked and couldn't be used again. So that would be, in fact, I don't know what percentage of homes in Lebanon County are built on sand from the shakeout. But you had to have at least 16 inches of soil, topsoil, on top of the sand. If you didn't have that, the sand would drain the water so rapidly that the grass would not survive. And matter of fact, when environmentalists like you became active and curious and so on, that sand was even rejected as being qualified to be used, even though it was a very deep foundation of a new home property. But the rough casting then had to move along on a line to what would be a treatment. First it had to be cleaned up so that the rough edges were disposed of. But then it also had to be heat treated, and that was all depending on the kind of steel that you ordered. Of course, stainless steel was more expensive than the carbon steel, although carbon by weight was a larger portion of the business. Stainless steel was more profitable. But there were, in the progress, for example, jet engines. When jet engines first came in, Lebanon Steel Foundry had a license with Perth Vickers in Sheffield, England. And Perth Vickers, we made round rings, stainless steel rings for jet engines, heat-resistant steel because it was subjected to those jet temperatures. And those were high quality and also profitable items that were important even to the defense of this country. But this was very late in the Second World War and, of course, immediately following. Unless machining is required. Now, we had a machine shop, but actually most of our castings were machined outside the plant to the customer's dimensions or
specifications?
Specifications, that's the word. The desire was always to have zero scrap, zero, which is fine. It's like a perfect world. But the effort was always to keep the scrap, in other words, castings which were not acceptable had to be returned to the furnace and everything redone. Then that the goal was always, of course, technically zero, but you always had at least 3%, 4%, 5% were considered to be, when I say acceptable, in the real world, that's what it proved to be. But your desire, of course, was to make every product, and every product presumably that go to your municipal building. 1962 and the dedication, go to the whichever end, north end or south end, and you'll see Lebanon Steel Foundry, the stainless steel signs that we made identifying the mayor and the city council people, and our Circle L trademark is on there. Or go out to the furnace, the Cornwall furnace, and they're the largest plaque we've ever made. Or go to Mount Lebanon Cemetery, and at the entrance there, that's a very large, it says Mount Lebanon Cemetery, and that was cast at Lebanon Steel Foundry. And the longest text we ever did was the one at the Cornwall furnace.
Was any water used in the manufacturing of your product?
Not to a significant degree. Of course, we use water in ordinary, the mundane purposes. But no, there's no unusual consumption of water that would be reflected in terms of the size of the industry. You have quenching tanks, which provide a certain quality or purpose in quenching the metal, the steel. But there's almost an a la carte menu in terms of the types of steel. They have what they call carbon and low alloy and high alloy or stainless steel. And that all suggests, as soon as you talk alloy, you're talking about different combinations depending upon the purpose and the use. Our big customer is the chemical industry, for example. Well, the big inch and little inch line. Now, during the war, as you may remember, the enemy was sinking oilers or tankers off the coast of New Jersey. So the oil from Texas coming by tanker up the East Coast, and the German submarines were so effective. Then they built the big inch and little inch line, and that brought the oil all across the country up to this area. Even the Texas Eastern Transmission, you see those orange pipes out in the company, that's all part of their organization. But then after the war, instead of oil, then of course that was converted to gas. So the natural gas that comes from the Texas oil fields, that is piped up here, but they had what they call the big inch and the little inch line. That involved a great many valves, and that was a very important part of Lebanon Steel Foundry's business. We had an office in Houston, Texas, and to cater or solicit but let's take the chemical industry, the oil industry, even transportation. Steel castings are made for so many, for even trains. There was an experimental train came from Spain called the Talgo train, and that was a high-speed, unusual design, such a low center of gravity it could go around curves at high speed. But we made parts for, especially in the early terms of the company. But then we get into the higher quality work, the higher caliber, or including the stainless steel. But as that grew, of course, and the company prospered. But the steel foundry industry was a very capital intensive and personnel intensive. In other words, it required a great deal of labor and a great deal of capital in order to produce. The margin, the profit margin, was much more modest than perhaps was, and it was was realized in the community, but it also very volatile. In other words, good times were good, but during the war they had the excess profits tax, which meant that you could keep 10 cents out of the dollar because so much of the work that you were doing was war work, and therefore it was heavily taxed. But the volatility, in other words, during the Depression era, it was, and when my father died, my mother and I were co-executors of his will, and I think it was September 26th of 1974, when, well, it was in the spring of '74, the Quinn family wanted to expand the company because the customers were coming through the windows. The business was so profitable, so good, and so on. My comment to my mother was, this is much like a surfer at the beach. This company, this business is so volatile. This happens to be a very good time. It's also a very good time, in my view, to sell. because I had sisters, I had a brother, and when you have a profitable company, but if it's privately held, upon the death, for instance, of Mr. Quinn, he died February 21st of 1955, and the company was still enjoying the very busy years connected with the Korean conflict. But therefore, when the Internal Revenue Service comes in and examines your books to determine the value of the company, that was very profitable at that time, so that was a very heavy inheritance tax. When my father died on June 22nd of 1962, we were very depressed, and therefore the inheritance tax is very modest indeed if the business at that time determined by the Internal Revenue when they examine the books. But if it's depressed, then of course the value is so low, the inheritance tax. So there was when I say I persuaded, I simply explained to my mother, this is the time to sell when the business is good. And so the Worrilow family on September 26, 1974, sold their 1/2 interest in Lebanon Steel Foundry to our two largest customers. James Berry came from Worcester, Massachusetts. Xomox, Xomox, came from Cincinnati, Ohio, and they formed a paper company called XJ. And that company, together, our two largest customers, valves, that was their product, largely valves, and they wanted to make sure they had a source, an important source of valves, and especially with business so good. And so they bought our 1/2 interest, and we were delighted to sell because then we had an evaluation. I had a sister, my older sister died on May 13th of 1978 at age 60. But then, since the company had been sold, we knew exactly what the value of her assets, because on the 2nd of January each year, our parents made the legally permitted gift to each of the children and even established trusts for the grandchildren, so that gradually to reduce their estates and increase the assets of the children and grandchildren, gifts were made within the limits of the law. Today it's $11,000, then it was $3,000 per individual. That's our,
The quenching tanks, I don't understand what that is.
well, it's just a body of water, or a tank of water.
How much?
Say 1,000 gallon, probably, or even more, but I must tell you, I do not know.
And something was dipped into these tanks?
Oh, the casting.
The casting?
Yeah.
For
See,
cooling
because
purposes?
Oh yeah, cool it immediately, so that locks in the qualities or the characteristics of the casting, when of course it feels the shock of the quench of the water.
And from where did this water come?
Well, always through the City of Lebanon Authority. We had no spring, we had no unusual source other than the City of Lebanon Authority. In other words, the customers that they have, I don't know what it was then, but today I think it's 16,500 customers and almost 17,000. Who's customers, I'm talking City of Lebanon Authority, that's the city plus surrounding areas, the Uniontown Gap VA Medical Center, we sell bulk water to Palmyra and so on. But that's all through the City of Lebanon Authority. The authority is owned by the City of Lebanon, but simply has the responsibility for owning and operating the water and the wastewater treatment facilities of the community.
When was that formed?
The authority,
Yes.
1935, and I'm not sure what date in 35, but well, I think it was the first authority in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. See, that's a body created for credit purposes, because the credit that they have is based on the fees that they can depend on from the customer, you see. And of course the customer, he doesn't have, it's a non-competitive basis. You need water, everybody needs water, and he has only one source to turn to, and if you're living here, other than the well. But obviously most of the customers are getting their water through the spigot, the faucet and so on in their homes or industry.
So if you were on public water supply, you got a monthly water bill. How many gallons of water a month did you use at the plant?
I can't answer that. I know the electricity bill for electric furnaces, that would exceed $3,000 a day for electric furnaces. But and today even more, because then you have to be careful of Met Ed, the electrical company, Metropolitan Edison Company, they have charges at certain times of day. In other words, if you go over that, you pay a premium. So you must be very careful when you consume that much electricity, the timing of the furnaces when they're turned on and so on. But that gets into some detail.
Any water ever discharged from the process?
Just in the ordinary way. In other words, through the sewage system or wastewater treatment operation.
How many, where did the water authority draw their water from?
Well, of course, I think it was November of 1945, perhaps December, and that's when the city took action to build the plant, not the plant, but build the reservoir, what was known as High Bridge. Until that time, of course, the water all came from the Rexmont dams, the two dams at Rexmont, which I'm sure you're familiar with. They are no longer used for several reasons, not sufficient volume, but also the transportation system. In other words, the pipeline has to be maintained. The lower dam, I'm sure has been breached by now. I'm not quite sure what the status is of the upper dam, but again, that has no contribution to make to the, all of our water, other than rainfall, comes from what is now known Christian E. Segrist Dam. Chris Segrist came from, he was an employee of Bethlehem Steel, and when the city bought the Bethlehem Steel water supply, Chris Segrist, who was so knowledgeable, came with it as an employee and was an outstanding management individual in terms of our water. But when he died of cancer, then we had such a high regard for him. So High Bridge was then named, and that the High Bridge capacity today is almost 1.2 billion gallons, just a small fraction, below 1.2 billion. But that's after we spent $17 million 12 years ago, I'm not sure, I'd have to think, but roughly when we expanded High Bridge. If you want a relationship to the 1.2 billion gallons at High Bridge in relation to the open pit mine at Cornwall, which is either 5 or 7 billion gallons. In other words, that water now goes, much of it to Elizabethtown on some contract basis and so on. But we, again, are concerned, I think, of yours and ours at the City of Lebanon Authority, is the dependable capacity for providing sufficient potable water under all conditions, drought and otherwise, for our customers. Not only today, but tomorrow, and of course today you'll have to help me, but I think we have 120,400 people in the 2000 census in the county of Lebanon. Now in the city of Lebanon, I think we have 24,500 people, which is shrinking. We peaked in 1960 at 30,045. Now we've retreated, but the city's the same size, still 4.3 square miles or something. But our concern is the ability beyond the year 2020 is to provide sufficient water, and that's what we're really the focus of our effort today in terms of ensuring that that's available. That places into an adversarial position with many environmentalists, of course, and this leads to the debate in terms of the reservoir at Swiftera State Park.